Holden. Just say the name, and for generations of Australians, it conjures up images, not just of cars, but of summer road trips, of the roar at Bathurst, of a family pulling up to the beach, sandy towels and sun-kissed kids spilling out. It was a name stitched into our surf towels, welded into the very identity of a nation. But now, it's gone. Not resting, not sleeping, just gone. And its demise wasn't some sudden dramatic crash, a single catastrophic event that blindsided everyone. No, this was a slow, agonizing bleed, a series of decisions, each one incrementally draining the lifeblood until the factory lights flickered off for good in 2017 and the iconic badge itself was finally erased in 2020. Tonight, we're not just looking back, we're rewinding the tape, dissecting 4 specific, crucial blunders that transformed Australia's proudest car maker from a national symbol into little more than a museum piece. Are you ready for the deep dive? Then let's buckle up. Think about 1948. Australia was still finding its feet after the war, a young nation brimming with optimism, building almost nothing on a grand scale, except for one thing, the very first Holden. It was more than a car, it was a statement, a symbol of what we could achieve. Fast forward 70 years, and we build even less. And that same Holden, that symbol of national pride, is extinct. So what happened? Was it those pesky tariffs? Was it the relentless competition from Tokyo's automotive giants? Not really. The truth, as we'll uncover, is far more uncomfortable. It was 4 profound, self-inflicted wounds, mistakes so glaring that honestly, any first-year economics student could have spotted them from the back row of a lecture hall. Stick around, because by the end of this, you won't just know what went wrong, you'll know exactly who held the knife, and perhaps more importantly, why those cuts never ever healed. Mistake 1. Falling in love with one car. In 1948, when the legendary 48215, affectionately known as the FX, rolled off the assembly line at Pagewood, a country genuinely lost its collective mind. It wasn't just a car, it was our car. One model, one engine, one dream. A dream of mobility, independence, and an Australian way of life. And for a long time, it worked beautifully. This singular focus on a large, robust family sedan defined Holden for decades. For the next 6 decades, in fact, Holden seemed to be stuck in a time warp, trying to reissue that same winning formula, a big 6-cylinder engine, a cabinous boot perfect for family holidays, and that undeniable big Aussie family feel. Think Kingswood, then Commodore, then Berliner, then Calais. Fundamentally, they were all variations on the same theme, the same footprint, just with different bow ties and trim levels. But while Holden was busy polishing its beloved sedan, the world, and more importantly the Australian household, was changing dramatically. The average family was shrinking, not growing. Petrol prices, once a minor consideration, started their relentless climb, making those thirsty sixes less appealing. And buyers, ever adaptable, began to discover entirely new categories of vehicles, the nimble, fuel-efficient hatchbacks, for instance. By the early 2000s, this shift was undeniable. The writing was on the wall, or rather, it was in the sales figures. By 2003, SUVs, those rugged, versatile, family-friendly vehicles, made up a staggering 20% of the market. And what did Holden offer in response to this monumental shift? A single, badge-engineered Jakaru, an Isuzu by another name, and proudly called it their SUV strategy. It wasn't just a misstep, it was a profound failure to adapt. Refusing to diversify wasn't just stubbornness, it was a love affair turned toxic. Holden was so deeply committed to its sedan legacy that it became blind to the evolving needs of its customers. While competitors like Toyota were flooding the market with a diverse range, the compact RAV4, the family-sized Kluger, the rugged Prado, and Mazda was seemingly taking over driveways with its ubiquitous CX whatevers, Holden remained fixated on polishing the same sedan. This wasn't just about missing out on a few sales, it was about a fundamental misunderstanding of market dynamics and scale. In a relatively small market like Australia, scale matters immensely. If you're only offering a handful of models, splitting perhaps 80,000 annual sales across them, you're paying supplier prices as if you're hand-building each mirror, each headlight, each piece of trim. You lack the immense purchasing power that global giants wield. Consider this, at its peak, Toyota built over 200,000 Camrys in one Victorian plant alone, destined for both local and export markets. That kind of volume drives down costs significantly. Holden's steadfast refusal to kill its darling, to move beyond its singular focus, meant that every other strategic decision, every attempt to cut costs or innovate, had to work around a car that no longer fit the average Australian driveway or, crucially, the balance sheet. This unwavering, almost sentimental attachment to one type of vehicle became a foundational crack in Holden's edifice, making it increasingly difficult to compete in a rapidly diversifying market. Mistake 2. Trusting government cash forever. From the moment the first Holden rolled off the line in 1948, right through to the early 1990s, governments at both federal, in Canberra, and state, in Spring Street in Victoria and other capitals, played a crucial role in propping up the local car maker. They kept Holden and the wider automotive industry flush with a generous cocktail of tariffs on imported cars, strict import quotas, and direct cash checks. At its absolute peak, the effective subsidy per vehicle topped an astonishing $2,000. For a long time, Holden didn't treat that money as temporary life support, a bridging loan to help them become self-sufficient. Oh no, they booked it. They budgeted it for it. They came to rely on it as if it were oxygen itself. It became an essential part of their business model rather than a temporary advantage. So when the Productivity Commission, an independent government advisory body, started asking some very pointed questions about the efficiency and sustainability of these subsidies in the 1990s, Holden found itself in a precarious position. They had no plan B. Instead of using those decades of protection and financial aid to build a robust export-oriented business that could stand on its own 2 feet, chasing lucrative export contracts in thriving markets like Thailand, the Middle East, or anywhere else that made sense, they did the opposite. They lobbied harder. They argued for more protection, more money, more of the same. It was a strategy built on expectation, not innovation. The cracks really started to show around 2008. The Australian dollar, buoyed by the mining boom, hit parity with the greenback, making Australian-made goods, including cars, significantly more expensive on the global market. Predictably, exports collapsed. The government's response, perhaps out of a sense of national pride or fear of job losses, was to double down. They introduced a $2 billion sustainability plan, essentially a massive cash injection. It was like paying someone to stay at the casino, hoping they'd somehow win back their losses, even though they'd already gambled away the house. But the fundamental issues remained. Every time the grant package even hinted at shrinking, Holden's finance team would suddenly discover that the plant was uncompetitive. This wasn't just an unfortunate coincidence, it was corporate speak for, "We never actually learned to swim without our water wings." They hadn't built a cost base that could survive without perpetual government assistance. They hadn't developed the export volumes that could leverage economies of scale. And by the time the last lifeline was finally cut in 2013, the political will had evaporated, leaving Holden with no sustainable cost base, no significant export volume, and crucially, no friends left on the hill to fight their corner. Turns out what some critics controversially labeled welfare queens don't get farewell parades, they just get closure notices. This reliance on government handouts fostered a culture of dependency, ultimately hindering Holden's ability to evolve into a truly competitive global player. Mistake 3. Ignoring the dollar's double-edged sword. Australia, for a good chunk of the 2000s, rode the mining boom straight into what economists called a currency supercycle. What did that mean for the average person? Well, if you were importing a shiny new LCD screen or a designer handbag, it was fantastic. Your Australian dollar stretched further. But if you were trying to manufacture a car here and ship a Commodore to Dubai, it was absolutely fatal. A strong dollar made Australian exports prohibitively expensive and imports incredibly cheap, creating a perfect storm for local manufacturers. Let's put it into perspective. When the Australian dollar was trading at, say, 110 yen to the dollar, Japanese plants could land a car on Australian shores, pay the 5% import tariff, and still undercut a locally built Holden by thousands of dollars. Think about that competitive disadvantage. What was Holden's answer to this massive economic headwind? Mostly, it seemed to be a desperate hope that the Reserve Bank of Australia would kindly crash the currency, making their exports cheaper overnight. Spoiler alert, The RBA doesn't take requests, nor does it typically act to prop up individual industries at the expense of broader economic stability. That was a fantasy, not a strategy. Meanwhile, every single component sourced domestically, from the glass for the windows, to the tires, to even the smallest screws, suddenly cost more in USD terms, the common currency for global trade. This pushed the local product further and further away from any global benchmark for competitiveness. Between 2010 and 2015, Holden's manufacturing costs, when measured in foreign currency terms, skyrocketed by a staggering 38%. During the same period, their sticker prices, what customers were willing to pay, essentially stayed flat. Try selling that spreadsheet to Detroit. It was an impossible tightrope walk.
The strong dollar wasn't some unpredictable act of God or bad luck. It was a predictable economic phenomenon that every other savvy exporter in Australia, from wine producers to wheat farmers, managed with proactive strategies. They used currency hedging to lock in exchange rates, established foreign supply chains to mitigate local cost pressures, or simply became relentlessly more productive and efficient to absorb the impact. Holden, however, seemed to adopt a wait-and-see approach, hoping the tide would simply turn on its own. The tide did eventually turn, as all economic cycles do, but only after the plant had already shut its doors for good. Their failure to proactively manage currency risk was another nail in the coffin, demonstrating a lack of foresight and adaptability in a globalized economy. General Motors, Holden's parent company based in Detroit, never truly understood right-hand drive, RHD markets. From their perspective, the volumes were too small, the steering wheel was on the wrong side, and the engineering costs required to adapt their global platforms were amortized over a mere handful of islands and the odd safari nation. It just didn't make sound business sense on a global scale. Holden, however, was historically GM's RHD hub. They were the experts. They built Caprice cop cars for the Middle East, manufactured Ute bodies that were shipped to South Africa, and even saw their iconic Monaro rebadged as the Pontiac GTO for the American market. For a long time, this was a profitable arrangement, a niche that Holden excelled in. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis hit, and GM, the mighty General Motors, went bankrupt. When a corporate behemoth faces collapse, every program not absolutely critical, every project not bolted directly to a North American truck platform faces the axe. The celebrated Zeta platform, which underpinned the Commodore and was a point of pride for Holden's engineering prowess, suddenly became an orphan. Decision-makers in some far-off Rentec office, poring over spreadsheets, looked at the numbers: 30,000 Aussie exports versus 400,000 Silverados. It was a no-brainer for them. Guess which program kept getting funding and which was slowly starved? From that moment, the writing was on the wall. Every new global safety regulation, every infotainment update, every fuel-saving widget developed in Detroit for the massive North American market now had to be retrofitted and re-engineered by a tiny, increasingly underfunded engineering team in Port Melbourne. The cost per car skyrocketed. It was an unsustainable model. Holden's local management, acutely aware of the problem, begged Detroit for a replacement platform, something modern and competitive. What did they get? A rebadged front-wheel drive Impala dressed up as a Holden. Customers, as you might expect, noticed. They weren't fooled. Sales, which had peaked at a respectable 132,000 units in 2008, began a precipitous slide, plummeting to a mere 43,000 by 2016. When your headquarters sees you as a rounding error, a statistical anomaly on a global balance sheet, you don't get the next shiny electric skateboard platform, you get placed in the brand morgue and labeled legacy. This distant, often indifferent oversight from Detroit, coupled with their inability to truly grasp the nuances of the Australian market and Holden's unique role, ultimately ensured that even if Holden had fixed its other problems, it was still operating on borrowed time, dictated by a playbook written thousands of miles away. If this story stings a little, if it makes you think, then please hit that subscribe button. Because next week, we're ripping the covers off Ford's equally painful exit from Australian manufacturing. Two icons died here, after all, and tragically, only one of them really got a eulogy that resonated. You absolutely don't want to miss that. The closure of Holden's manufacturing operations wasn't just a corporate announcement, it was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through communities across Australia. Elizabeth, a suburb in South Australia, was the first to fall silent. 3,000 direct jobs vanished overnight. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The true carnage rippled outwards, impacting perhaps 10,000 more jobs across a sprawling network of suppliers. Then came Fisherman's Bend Engineering in Victoria, another 1,000 highly skilled positions gone. But the real heartbreaking story was the downstream devastation, the countless smaller businesses that relied entirely on the automotive ecosystem. Think about the plastics plant in Woodville that molded dashboards, the tool makers in Campbellfield who crafted intricate dies, the countless small engineering firms, the logistics companies, and even the humble diner near the factory gate that had sold meat pies and coffees to shift workers for 40 years. These weren't just businesses, they were the fabric of communities. Regions that were already battling double-digit unemployment suddenly discovered in the most brutal way possible what structural unemployment truly meant. It wasn't temporary, it was a fundamental shift, a permanent void. The economic impact was profound and immediate. South Australia's economy, heavily reliant on manufacturing, flatlined. Victoria, while more diversified, still lost an estimated $1 billion in wages annually. Governments, caught flat-footed, scrambled to introduce retraining packages. But how do you retrain an entire town of skilled welders, assembly line workers, and machinists into writing code or becoming baristas? The skills were specialized, the jobs were gone, and the transition was often impossible for those who had dedicated their lives to an industry that no longer existed. The closure also delivered a crippling blow to Australia's apprentice programs. Holden, for decades, had been one of the largest trainers of technicians, engineers, and tool makers in the country, providing invaluable hands-on experience that no TAFE course alone could replicate. When the line stopped, so did that vital skills pipeline. The long-term consequences are still unfolding. Today, Australia doesn't just import cars, we increasingly import the expertise required to maintain them. We pay Germany for diagnostic software, Japan for cutting-edge hybrid batteries, and Korea for infotainment updates. The icon died, yes, but we effectively shipped the funeral bill, a bill for lost skills, lost innovation, and lost self-reliance directly to our future selves. It was a national wound that will take generations to heal, if it ever truly does. Let's be brutally honest and kill the nostalgia for a moment. It's a comforting thought to imagine a white knight, some billionaire savior, or a visionary politician stepping in to reverse the tide. But the cold hard truth is that no single entity could have undone all of these four deeply entrenched mistakes once they had locked in over decades. The problems were too systemic, too interwoven. Consider Toyota, for instance. They stayed in Australia longer than Holden because their local operations weren't solely reliant on the domestic market. They had a robust export strategy, shipping hundreds of thousands of Camrys to the Gulf states and building 500,000 units locally for both domestic and international consumption. Holden, at every peak, rarely cracked 90,000 units. That difference in scale is monumental. Even if Canberra had doubled its subsidies, the math for Holden was simply brutal. Labor costs 30% higher than in places like Thailand, a domestic market size 1/10 of the United States, and engineering overheads shared across a skeleton range of vehicles. It was an unsustainable equation. The only truly viable play, the only realistic path forward, would have been a radical downsizing of expectations and operations. This would have meant shuttering local manufacturing entirely, importing a lean lineup of global GM vehicles, and attempting to ride the remaining waves of Holden's immense brand equity. Think about what Britain did with MG. The brand lives on, but the manufacturing is long gone. GM actually tried this rebranding in 2018, introducing models like the Equinox, Acadia, and Trailblazer, all wearing the iconic Lion badge. But by then, it was too late. Buyers walked past. They didn't see a new Holden, they saw rebadged foreign cars, and the emotional connection was severed. Turns out nostalgia doesn't sell crossovers, not when the soul of the brand has already departed. By 2020, GM finally pulled the plug worldwide, retiring the Holden brand entirely. Holden's death wasn't a sudden murder, it was in essence an assisted suicide, stretched out over decades of poor decisions, missed opportunities, and a fatal inability to adapt to a changing world. So there you have it, the 4 critical mistakes that ultimately sealed Holden's fate. An undying, almost romantic love affair with one specific type of sedan, blinding them to market shifts. A debilitating addiction to government subsidies that utterly rotted away any semblance of cost discipline. A blind, almost naive faith that the Aussie dollar would somehow bail them out, rather than proactively managing currency risk. And finally, a parent company in Detroit that viewed right-hand drive markets and Holden itself as nothing more than an afterthought. Any one of these blunders in isolation might have been survivable, but together they formed a perfect escapable noose, tightening slowly but surely around the neck of an Australian icon.
The lion is gone, the assembly halls are silent, and the vibrant hum of Australian manufacturing has faded into an echo. Now, every time an imported SUV rolls past with its anonymous vacant grille, you can almost hear the faint ghostly echo of a 186 red motor, revving one last time, yelling, "Aussie, Aussie, Aussie," back at you. Holden taught us how to build cars, how to dream big, and then, painfully, tragically, it taught us how not to. Keep the memories alive, by all means. Sell the memorabilia. Cherish the stories. But next time someone promises to protect an industry with nostalgia instead of hard numbers, remember the slow, agonizing bleed that killed an icon. And ask yourself if we've truly learned the lesson.